Hey there, friend. Welcome to another episode of Ponder and Practice. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today. It is, of course, as ever, such a pleasure and an honor to be sharing some time and space with you. So, thanks for hanging out with me today. What we're going to be talking about on today's episode has to do with how to prevent overwhelm and even potentially burnout, how to manage ourselves and take care of ourselves in such a way that we are lessening the likelihood of becoming overwhelmed. Of course, life is life and things happen, and certainly overwhelm can happen for, any number of reasons. But foundationally, just in the course of day to day operations, I think that a lot of overwhelm has to do with the fact that we are simply taking in too much of the world around us. I read something recently that I'm not sure that I altogether agree with, but the sentiment was that, for hundreds of years, our existence was really based on what we were doing moment to moment, what was right in front of us physically. And that was a time when maybe our hearts and souls were a little bit more settled. Now we have access to basically infinite amounts of information at any given moment. And so, necessarily, this means that our lives feel different, that we are expending way more mental energy and emotional energy, I would also say, because we are now connected, quote unquote, connected to things that are happening across the world 24/7, 365 days a year. And it's too much. It's too much for any of us to take in a meaningful way and to make sense of. My goodness, it's impossible to make sense of all of the information that we have coming at us day to day. Even in just the United States, the news cycle is bananas. And so if you take in also like what's going on in the rest of the world and the fact that you can scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll and never get to the end of all of the information is just absurd. And so how do we deal with this? How do you make sense of the world around you and wrangle all of that information such that you can actually pay attention to what matters in your own life and even, make sure that you know what really matters in your own life and make sense of that. So I wanted to talk about that today. The way that we do this is a process that is called many different things in many different traditions. I am going to call it, in the tradition of human design, quote unquote, emptying out. And what this means is what it sounds like, is sort of emptying yourself out of the information of the day, the energies of the day on a regular basis, ideally on a daily basis, because every day we're going through all kinds of experiences, we're meeting all kinds of people, we're taking in all kinds of information around us. And so we need this time and space on a daily basis to really let that drain from our being. This what I'm going to talk about first is why this is a practice in human design and we already said what it refers to, but why it refers to this. And then we will talk through, some different ideas of how to do this effectively and why it's not going to look the same for everyone. And then if you are not somebody who is necessarily in a space to be willing or able to take this on as a daily practice, what's an alternative that you can do to still integrate some of this into your life and potentially see some benefit, but not be overwhelmed by yet another thing that you need to be doing on a day-to-day basis. So with all of that said, let's get going. And so if you are looking at a human design chart, what you will see is that there are centers. These are shapes. There are 9 of them, 9 energy centers. And in the chart, these will either be white or they will be colored in. How they're colored in will depend on where the chart is from. Some companies will have very specific colors that they'll use. They're different for each center. There are reasons for that, but we won't get into that now. And then some, every center will just be the same color, but it'll be colored in. And so it doesn't really matter. But what that means if a center is colored in is that it's defined. And this means that this is something that is part of you. It is part of the person that you are. This is not something that you need to work at or cultivate or reach for in any sort of way. This is just part and parcel of the person that you are on this earth. And so there are different qualities per center that are stronger depending on where there's definition in the chart. There are also places in the chart, of course, that are white or undefined, and this is potentially much more interesting for our conversation today, certainly more relevant to our conversation today, because these places that are white or undefined are places where we don't come into this world with those strong characteristics. And so we are very susceptible to the conditioning of the wider world, of the culture at large, of our families, of the people around us. These are places where we really take in the energy around us and amplify it. And so these are sources where overwhelm can show up in a really strong way. And so kind of knowing what these different centers do and what in particular they're amplifying can be very helpful in making sure that we are kind of anticipating potential overwhelm and accounting for that so that it doesn't happen so much. So as you're looking at the chart, if we start from the head, if we start from the top of the chart, the first center there is the head. And so overwhelm here can really show up as intense pressure to know things. It's mental pressure. I need to know. What are the answers? I want to know what's going on. The ajna is the next center down, and overwhelm here can show up about, really getting overwhelmed with ideas and the need to figure things out. This is it's similar to the head, but a little bit nuanced. The theme of these two together is certainly the pressure or the overwhelm to know things, like really searching out information, finding more information, so that you have answers, you have things quote unquote figured out. The next center is the throat center, and this is all about craving attention, and maybe acting out to get that attention. So feeling really overwhelmed, like, oh my gosh, nobody's paying attention to me. I need to do this, that, and the other so that people will pay attention to me and so that I can get the attention that I'm wanting and needing. The G center has to do with feeling lost, overwhelmed about, I don't even know who I am in this life. What am I supposed to be doing in the first place? Like, I don't know what to do with this. And that kind of an overwhelmed feeling. The heart overwhelm can show up as jealousy and a lot of shoulds, like I should be doing things differently. I should know what I'm doing. I should know where I'm going, these kinds of things. And it can also have to do with an overwhelm of feeling like you're not disciplined enough, like you don't have a strong sense of drive and you're not consistent in taking action and really like, oh my gosh, I need to be doing all these things and I'm not, and so that's not okay. The spleen is the neck center, and overwhelm here really shows up like fear and insecurity. People can be really paralyzed by this kind of overwhelm and feeling just very terrified about, I don't know what I'm doing and I don't know what's going to happen, and it could all go terribly sideways. The sacral center overwhelm has to do with pressure to do, to keep going, to be productive. This is a very common kind of overwhelm in our world, and so it can be helpful to be aware of that as well, particularly if you have that center undefined. The solar plexus center overwhelm is all about avoiding upset and confrontation and even failure. And then finally, the root at the very bottom of the chart, this has a lot to do with pressure to do in order to feel valid and needed. And so hopefully that list can give you a little sense of how these different kinds of overwhelm might show up for you. This can be helpful because we tend to think about overwhelm as just one thing that doesn't, like, overwhelm is always the same. We think of it as a very homogenous experience, and it's not. We can be overwhelmed by information, certainly, and oh my gosh, like there's so much coming at me and I don't know how to sort through all of this. It can also be very overwhelming to be in a space that is just too much energy, right? Like there's too much going on in a particular space. And yes, we could qualify that as information. There's information being carried in sound. We can see things visually. There are people moving around potentially that we can feel. And so, yes, all of those things convey information, but it's a slightly different flavor than, the emotional overwhelm of, I don't want to go to this event because I'm going to have to talk to somebody and have a difficult conversation that I don't really want to have. These are different kinds of overwhelm or anticipation. So this can be helpful, particularly in the context of human design, obviously, to really help help you pinpoint where is your overwhelm most commonly coming from. When you know that, it makes it much easier to start to, it's called deconditioning, this process of letting go of what the world around us has told us that we should be and leaning more into who it is that we actually are instead. And when it comes to information and overwhelm and processing the world around us, it's very common to think that only our minds need to process information. But in fact, this is not necessarily the case, in that in order for us to really move through the world and make sense of the world, yes, we do have to have some cognitive awareness of what's going on and process information intellectually. But we also have to process information through our physicality and our physical bodies, and the energy centers throughout our bodies, and the awareness centers throughout our bodies. And so it's important to, one, be aware of that. Sometimes, if you've ever heard something or seen something or had an experience and you're like, ugh, like something about this just isn't sitting right, it's not, that's not a cognitive intellectual experience. That's a physical experience of something feels physically off or wrong or just like not okay about this thing. And so that's one way that you can think about, like, it's not just about processing information intellectually, it's also about making space for the body to be able to do what it needs to do in order to process the information that it has available. And this is part of why this process of quote unquote emptying out is so important, because it makes space for the body to process information in the way that it needs to. And in order to do this effectively, a couple of things are important. One is to realize that this is going to look different for everyone. It will not be the same process person to person. And so if you have a friend, maybe you have a friend who likes to sit in meditation for 2 hours a day, and that helps them feel like themselves. They feel like they can go out in the world and they are able to adequately deal with all the information that's coming at them. And that's great. For other folks, that is not going to work. Like not having 2 hours to sit in meditation necessarily, but also there are some folks for whom just sitting in meditation and having that quiet, still experience is not super helpful. And so maybe for them, it looks more like having a walk or doing some dancing or whatever. And so recognize that your process is going to be your process, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And it doesn't need to look like anyone else's process necessarily. Another thing that's important to recognize and realize is that this can take some experimentation to figure out. Like anything in sort of the, mind, body, spirituality, kinds of spaces, you need to test things out for yourself. There shouldn't be any coercion or somebody telling you this is what it is. If your experience is telling you that thing doesn't work for me, that's fine. That's very important to keep in mind. And if one thing doesn't work, you can change it and try something different. And so always keep that in mind as you're going through this, anything else that is related to kind of self-improvement, self-mastery, et cetera, what have you, even productivity. And the final thing that I want to say about this sort of upfront is that it is important to have some kind of practice of emptying out on a day-to-day basis. Easier said than done. I realize I too am busy. I get it. And I think the sentiment still stands that we do go out in the world. We're engaged with other people. We're engaged in our work. We're engaged with our families and the world at large every day. And so as a part of hygiene, every day you brush your teeth, every day you take a shower, every day, you hopefully are washing your dishes and this sort of thing. It's just the same as that. Taking care of ourselves and preventing overwhelm and dealing with overwhelm has to be a daily practice in order for things not to get out of hand necessarily, right? If you think about this example of brushing your teeth, if you don't brush your teeth every day for like a year or 6 months, you're probably going to have to get some fillings done whenever you do finally go to the dentist. And so similarly, if we're not taking good care of ourselves and minding and preventing overwhelm on a day-to-day basis, at a certain point that's going to come for us, and that can look like getting sick, getting the flu, burning out altogether, starting to lose some empathy and compassion, like caregiving burnout, this kind of thing. And so we need to take care of it day to day when things are manageable and smaller to prevent things from getting bigger and out of control. So I have heard some folks who teach human design say that you have to spend X amount of time per open or undefined center per day in order to quote unquote empty out. I happen to disagree with that. It just doesn't make sense to me that everyone would require the same time alone or in silence or whatever it is. And so if you hear that kind of thing as you're kind of going around and looking at different information on the internet about like deconditioning or emptying out in human design and whatnot, I would take all of those recommendations with a grain of salt. Like I said earlier, try them, see if it works for you. But there are 9 centers in the human body, and if somebody's a reflector and has all 9 of them open, you're trying to tell me that they need to spend hours every day emptying out. I just maybe they do, and that's awesome, but I have a hard time accepting that that is a recommendation that is appropriate for everyone. So I just want to call that out and bring that to our awareness in this conversation. What most matters out of all of this, and I sort of buried the lead a little bit, but what most matters in this is that you're able to get to a place where, one, of course, you're not feeling overwhelmed. You're not feeling like you're getting to a point where every day you're just over your limit in what you're physically, mentally, emotionally capable of, right? That's what we're after here. The secondary goal, which is actually the primary goal if we're talking about human design, which we are, is that you're putting yourself in a position that you can really be attuned to your own strategy and authority. I'm going to link in the description. I thought I had an audio episode for this and I don't, but I'm going to link in the description a post that I put together about strategy and authority in human design. And this is what it's all about. So if we're all the time overwhelmed, we're running around and just totally bought into all of the conditioning of the world around us, that we're not enough, that we need to be doing, that something terrible is going to happen if I don't, quote, follow the rules. That I need to absolutely know what's going on all the time, that I have to know who I am. I have to know what my purpose is every day, no matter what, that I need to be taking actions every day to move me towards my goals. If we are all of the time bought into those things and that's not who we are, it will cloud our ability to really tap in to our ability to make good decisions for ourselves. And so this is why this process of emptying out and also deconditioning is so critically important. If you're new to human design, strategy and authority are the primary ways that we move throughout the world. If you learn nothing else in human design ever, strategy and authority are the things that are worth knowing and worth practicing. And in fact, it is said that learning to practice these 2 things well is really the work of a lifetime. And so you can certainly keep yourself plenty busy with just those couple of things. But if and like I just said, the reason why I think that this whole concept of managing overwhelm is so important is because it helps you to tap into that work of learning how to use your strategy and authority really effectively in a much better way. And so thus far we have talked about, this idea of emptying out and sort of this idea of deconditioning and how different kinds of overwhelm might sound depending on the definition or lack of definition in your chart. And what we haven't talked about is more specifically, how do you go about doing this whole thing of like quote unquote emptying out? So this will vary person to person, like I said, but what really is the take home point, regardless of the specific logistics that you choose? What really matters is that you are not taking in information from the outside world, but you are letting yourself exist in time and space, maybe creating something, moving your body in ways that are helpful for you, but not reading, not learning, not seeing videos, like all these different kinds of things, not scrolling on social, etc., etc., etc. Emptying out is really about your ability to sort of be in your own head, sit in your own space, be in your own energy, and let the experiences of the day kind of just move through and wash through without being attached necessarily to anything that has gone on throughout the day. This can look like creative pursuits. So, for some, it might be like drawing or painting or making music or singing, something like this, dancing even. For some, it might be cooking or journaling, walking. It could also look like daydreaming or prayer, meditation, this kind of thing. I know for me, anytime I am sat in front of a fire just watching it, this is prime emptying out time for me, and I always will feel more refreshed and rejuvenated after the fact. A way that you can tell if this has been a useful practice is one, like I said before, feeling like you can better tune into your strategy and authority, which of course we're not talking about here. I do have a quick start guide on my website, which will walk you through all of the strategies and authorities. You can also get your virtual reading on the website, which will be specific to you only and has everything that you will need to know about your own strategy and authority. So if you want to dive deeper, check those out. They'll be in the description below. But so one way that you'll know if it's effective is that you're feeling like you can tune into your strategy and authority a little bit better. Another way that you can tell that this has been an effective practice is that you're less overwhelmed. And so this is very practical. Yes, you can take it to an esoteric place, but practically speaking, the whole point of doing this exercise of having something on a day-to-day basis where you can like empty out and like let all of that go is so that you're not feeling stressed and anxious and freaked out about like the 20,000 million things that are going on in the world globally or, in your personal life or at work and all of these different things. And so if you're coming out of your practice on a regular basis and you're like, oh yeah, I feel a lot better actually, like I'm feeling a little bit more calm, I'm feeling a little bit more grounded, I'm not feeling quite so, at the upper limit of what I can handle, check, it's working. So that's a very quick and effective way to tell if this is helpful. What I said this earlier, but I just want to kind of re-emphasize what this practice doesn't look like is anything that's going to put more information into your field, into your mind, put energy into your energetic system that isn't yours. And so things that are not going to be conducive to emptying out are things like scrolling, watching videos, watching a TV show, reading books. I love reading myself, but there is a different time and place for it than when you are trying to empty out from the day. It also doesn't look like calling a bunch of people that you know to ask for advice and what should you do and oh my gosh, did you hear what this happened, and calling this friend and that family member and your sister and your parents and all of this, right? And this brings us to something that is very important to acknowledge as we're like talking about emptying out and moving through this process of emptying out. So in our modern world, it is very difficult for us to sit with ourselves, to be kind of on our own without the ever-present inputs of our phone or people around us or, the radio or the TV or whatever it is. And so that's important to acknowledge that it is really difficult to sit in quiet, to explore our creativity, to engage in movement in a way that isn't necessarily quote unquote productive. It can feel a lot like frivolity or like a waste of time. Particularly, like our mind is conditioned to productivity, and there are also practical parts of us who are really focused on the balance sheet of like the hours and the minutes of the day that are scheduled. And so trying to shoehorn one more thing in there is like, oh my gosh, you've got to be kidding me. So I do think that's important to acknowledge and to pay attention to. That doesn't make it not worth trying necessarily, but it does mean that it's worth being aware of that these are some challenges that are probably going to come up, and accounting for them is helpful. The other thing to be aware of is that if this is an altogether new practice, or maybe you had like a meditation practice or something for a long time and then kind of fell away from it and you're coming back to it, it's really important to have the expectation that it's going to be uncomfortable, right? So we just talked about like, yeah, it'll sometimes it just feels silly and you're like, oh, why am I doing this? Like I'm painting, I'm like have my watercolors out on a Wednesday night. Like I have other things I should be doing probably. Well, maybe, but maybe not. Maybe that's exactly what you need to be doing. It can also just be straight up uncomfortable where you're like, I don't know. Like, what do I necessarily have to put out here? If you're somebody who is picking up a writing practice as a way of sort of emptying out at the end of the day, staring at a blank page can be very overwhelming. And so it's worth being aware of and being prepared for the fact that likely it's going to be pretty gosh darn uncomfortable the first, few 20, 30, I don't know, many times that you try to do this. Your mind is likely going to fight you. There are thoughts that, like I said, that it's silly, it's not a good use of your time, this is absolutely absurd. If you're a parent, you may feel that it's overly selfish, that you shouldn't be dedicating any time to this because, there are things that your kids need or whatever. Sometimes this is true, and often it's more nuanced than that. And so I do want to bring that up as well. It's important to acknowledge these thoughts, to check the truth of them, and to be sort of brutal about checking the truth of them, and then keep going. I recommend giving it a go for at least a week, if not a month. A month is certainly ideal. And keeping track of things like how relaxed are you feeling? How overwhelmed are you feeling? What are the habitual thoughts that you have? Are they changing at all? Like if you are somebody who's always thinking, oh my gosh, this isn't going to go well, the worst is going to happen, there's no way this is going to work out for me. Are those thoughts still there? Are they less loud, or have they maybe gone away in frequency? I will often talk with folks in my practice who, will talk about the fact that anxious thoughts, we know that something is working because those anxious thoughts, rather than being a loudspeaker that's in the same room just like blaring at them all of the time, now it feels like, oh, like there's still a loudspeaker that I can hear, but it's at the end of my block and it's not in my room. And so the volume and intensity of these kinds of thoughts can make a really big difference. And so paying attention to that as well.